All right, everybody. So this is a presentation that's part of a series on creating AI-powered adaptive card web parts. And what we're trying to do is to include pretty much every single feature, make the web part extensible, and all that crazy stuff. Before I show you the cool stuff, let's actually show you the timeline here. So we've talked about creating custom property panes, adding a UI theme, adding AI-powered layout creation. We've indexed content so SharePoint can actually find the rendered adaptive cards and be able to, have our users find the web parts. And now we're going to add, fancy animation here. We're going to add data connectivity. And what do we mean by that? We mean making things flexible with where we get the data from. So now let's go to our demo. So this is the web part that you've seen now a million times, I'm sure. And what you'll notice is that, we have the good old describe the web part, the adaptive card you want, and it'll render an adaptive card for you. But what we want to focus on today is this part right here. And I'm gonna pretend I'm David. I'm gonna use the fancy highlights here. There you go. So what we can do is we can actually specify I don't want any data. I just want to hard code the values in my adaptive card. We can say I want to grab data from static data that I've provided here. But we could also say I want to grab data from a SharePoint list, from an API, and from an RSS feed. And the idea is that we built this so that we'll be able to add more and more data providers. So any crazy ideas that we have, we can, like, let's say we wanted to add, I don't know, Power Platform connectors or things like that. We could actually add these extra connectors right here and make it possible to get the data from it. Now, one thing you'll notice is depending on what I'm selecting, I'm getting a different set of configuration settings. So if I have static data, I'm actually showing an entry where I can put the static data right here. If I'm showing SharePoint, I can pick a list and so on and so forth. Now, to speed up the demo, what I've done is I've actually pre-configured some examples. So this is an example here where I've created a adaptive card template, or I've stolen an adaptive card template here from sample, and I've provided static data. So if I change the data here, let's see, where's the reimbursable amount? I should have probably looked at that before. All right, I'm not gonna do that. All right, there you go. Let's make this sample a bit more up to date. 2026, 22, 7, 6, whatever. Eventually, the data will update here. Although I should probably pick the fields that are highlighted on the page, but that's okay. Here's another example where what I've done here is I've actually just created a simple template that grabs the data from the or the adaptive card just renders the data. And so you can see here if I say hello, Bo, you'll see that it updates immediately, right? Don't pay attention to the refresh button here. I've added this for demo purposes, which I'll be using very shortly. Now, if I actually get a list, for example, here I have a list of events. You'll see that it's just a regular SharePoint list. And if I go to my fancy adaptive card here and I say that I'm using SharePoint and I'm grabbing from that list, if I refresh the data from that list, you'll see that the events are coming in. And to prove that, I'll just go add quickly a new event. I'll say Bo's birthday. And I don't know when Bo's birthday is, but we'll pretend it's like right here. And what a shame. All right, so Bo's birthday's been added here. If I go back to this list, and you see it's not there. But if I refresh, the data will be updated. So this data provider specializes in getting data from a SharePoint list. Now let's try this one. So this is our fancy web part and extension sample browser, right? So again, Bo, I'm picking on Bo today, but if I list all the web parts that Bo has provided, I can get a list here. Now this is actually available as a JSON feed. So what I've done here is I've actually just gone and configured an API call where I've provided a get the data from the SharePoint pages or the SharePoint sample browser. Now I've used the CORS proxy to do this, but in future code, I'll update this to actually get the data directly. But so if I get this, now I get a list of samples with their description and their thumbnails and things like that. So how do I do this? How do I do some crazy customizable data sources? Well, let's get to it. So the first thing is I created an interface that's that I call originally iDataSource. I'm really original with my names. And what I do is I actually have a property bag, basically, of records, string and unknown. So I don't know what's going to be stored in there, but it allows every data source to have any kind of properties that it needs to have in order to connect to the data. Then I have a method called onInit, which passes the web part context that can get called when it's time to initialize the provider, as well as a standardized fetch data, which will go get the data for me when it's time to return data. But the other thing that I've done is I have a standardized method to get me the property pane group configuration for that provider. So that means that when I change a provider, it automatically gets a new list of fields to insert in the property pane, and it binds it to the data. I have something to notify when the property panes, the properties get updated. And then finally, I have one that gets information about the data source. Now, that data source information provider really returns me a list of names, icon properties, image source. If I don't want to use icons, I want to provide my own alternate because I like to try to make things as accessible as possible, as well as selected image source in case I want to have a different image or different highlight color or something like that, or animate an image when it gets selected, excuse me. And then the key to make it unique, and the service key that I use to actually instantiate the class that I need for that provider dynamically. And then what I've done behind the scenes is I have an instance of every data source that I want that implement the iDataSource interface. So the API, the RSS, the SharePoint list, the static data. I'm pretty sure I'm forgetting one here, but it doesn't matter. Now, what I also have is a data source factory. So I'm using the factory pattern where I can create a constructor here to retrieve the provider. And then I have a series of built-in providers that are already there. So I don't need to search for those. I know they're always going to be in my solution. But the idea here is that we'll be able to add even later when we start talking about extensibility, I'll be able to add new data providers without having to recompile the web part. We'll be able to just add them in live. Then I have something that creates an instance using the key. And really what it does is it finds the data source and constructs it for me. And then I have a function to return the list of available data sources so I can list them in a fancy interface. Now I've had to add a new, or I already had a data source property for my web part itself and my web part builder web part. But now I've added a new one, which is my property bag, basically for the data source properties for each selected data source. Finally, in the get property pane configuration, again, that's the method that gets called when it's time to display the property pane for your web part. I have the good old, card template that you saw before, which shows the Monaco editor that allows me to edit the JSON and call the AI and stuff like that. That's not what we're focusing on today. Today, we're focusing on the data group name. And that lists basically this part here. And how do we do that? Well, the first thing we do is we, the job of a group is to provide the list of fields that will be shown. In this case, I only have pretty much, I have a field for the data sources itself and a field for the properties for the selected data source. So I call the get available data sources to get me the list of data sources. And then, come on. There you go. I then build a list of options that I will add to that control. I'll always start with a no data one because sometimes I don't want to use a provider. But then for every provider, I actually just get the provider information from the interface that's called get information, and I push that to my array, and then I return a property pane choice group, which gives me the fancy buttons that I can select. Then when I select a different thing, I want to add additional fields. So in the same method here, what I do is I actually say, well, for this instance that's currently selected, go first of all create a method that I'll call when the provider changes and when the properties change, and then I don't need to do anything with that. I'll re-render if the properties change, and then I go get the list of property pane group from the provider itself. So the provider is responsible for telling me exactly what fields it will need to display. And, ooh, that was fancy. And then finally, when I initialize the web part and when I render the web part, I do the usual get the theme and everything. But the new part here is that I go get the instance of the data source if there is a data source selected, and then if there is a data source instance, I actually just call oninit for it so that each provider is able to do whatever it needs to do to prepare itself to retrieve data. And so that's it. Now, we've talked about data connectivity today. Next time, we'll talk about how we can create that web part or adapt that web part to be able to put it in something that we call full bleed rendering, which is across the entire page, let's say in a communication page or something like that. We'll do that next time. That's it for me. Until then, if you want more information about how to use adaptive cards, you can go to adaptivecards.io.